Welcome to this video. In this episode, the final episode of risks in cross-border trade, we discuss the various risks that was discussed in the previous sessions by way of a thorough case study. Let us look at the case of Huawei. We will understand the impact of sanctions. Now, the various risks that we face in international trade are financial risk, transport risk, political risk, regulatory risk, legal risk, and then comes the sanctions risk. Now, Huawei was subjected to US sanctions. There were trade restrictions. Huawei is a Chinese multinational company. They were a global leader in telecommunications equipments, like setting up exchange or smartphones, and they were also leaders in consumer electronics. They faced a seismic disruption in 2019 when the US government imposed stringent trade restrictions on them. The reasons cited were national security. They had concerns over alleged ties of the Huawei corporate with the Chinese government. So these sanctions or economic measures targeted the company's access to critical technologies. Their supply chain was disrupted and their global markets were targeted. The sanctions triggered a cascade of challenges, from several supplier relationships to lost market share, forcing Huawei to navigate an existential crisis in its cross-border operations. Now, is this a political risk because a government took an action because of their anger with another government? Is it a economic decision only, or is it a military decision because the sensitivity over the security concerns of their products? Is it only a risk that the company faces based on the counterparty's capabilities or not? Is it a transport and operational risk? What it is, what they faced. It is a multitude of cascading effects that Huawei faced, though the trigger was sanctions on them by the US government due to the closeness of this company with the Chinese government. We will have to see how the sanctions impacted Huawei. That is, we have to analyze the mechanisms of US restriction, their ripple effects on the company, semiconductor supply, software ecosystem, and 5G dominance. Now, what are the strategies that Huawei employed will also have to be examined because they were short-term survival tactics as well as long-term strategic pivots that were undertaking. We will try to dissect and we will try to see how weaponization of trade policies and resilience required by the corporate are today's necessities or truths. Let us have an overview of the sanctions. The US government actions were coordinated effort to curb not only the company's global influence, but it were driven by concerns of cybersecurity, espionage, technological competition. One main thing was the 5G capability of Huawei. These measures reshaped Huawei's operations and set a precedent for technology-focused trade warfare. First, the entity list designation happened in 2019. The US Department of Commerce, Bureau of Industry and Security added Huawei and 68 of their affiliates to the sanctioned entity list. This means US companies were barred from dealing with Huawei. That means nobody can supply to Huawei if you're a US corporate. You cannot give them goods or services or technology without a special license. And technically, as you know, this was a targeted measure. License will never be granted. That means trade is halted. Imports of Huawei took a toss. Immediate impact was that software restriction. Google suspended Huawei's access to Android update. Google mobile devices could not function further. Play Store was taken away. YouTube was taken away. Gmail was taken away. So this will cripple Huawei's ability to offer a competitive smartphone outside China. Because in China, alternative OS can work, but outside China, you required Android. Then there were hardware cutoffs. Major US chip makers like Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, Linux, they ceased to supply the processors, modems, and other components. So Huawei's smartphones, servers, networking gear, everything could not proceed in production. Then comes a financial strain. Huawei's procurement cost surged because it scrambled for alternatives. There were estimated losses of 8 to 10 billion, $8 to 10 billion in 2019 alone because of the disrupted supply chain. Then came the foreign direct product rule. The US tightened the export control by amending the foreign direct product rule to restrict foreign made products that use US origin technology, software, or equipment. This targeted Huawei's access to semiconductor produced globally. So, if semiconductors are produced elsewhere, not in US, but if they are supplied to Huawei, then it will get subject to this foreign product control rule because the foreign made product which is having a US origin technology, because semiconductor technology is of US origin, that cannot be sold. So the impact was that Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's leading chip maker, was forced to halt production of Huawei's chips because they accounted for 90% of Huawei's advanced chip supply. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. Then the paralysis is that without TSMC's the 5 nanometer chip, Huawei's ability to manufacture high-end smartphone or 5G base station was severely impacted. That means Huawei could not do anything more with their 5G technology. Then comes the global reach part. The non-US firms like South Korea's Samsung and Japan restricted sales to Huawei because if they deal with Huawei, they will be subject to secondary sanction, and this amplified the supply chain choke. Then comes a bigger hardware impact on the 5G equipment ban. The US launched a Clean Network Initiative, which pressurized allies to exclude Huawei from 5G infrastructure bid due to espionage risk. Countries like UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, Sweden, they restricted use of Huawei's 5G equipment in their telephone network. So this is a market exclusion. Huawei lost access to lucrative Western market. This loss was around $40 billion in 2022. Competitive shift. Rivals like Nokia, Ericsson, they capture 20% of Huawei's market, particularly in Europe and North America. Then came the geopolitical fallout. The ban deepened US-China tension, prompting retaliatory Chinese policies favoring domestic tech firms. Then in 2022-23, US came with additional measures. For example, US Treasury barred American investment in Huawei, limiting access to money. Then the Five Eyes Alliance, that is the US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the UA members tightened scrutiny of Huawei's operations from R&D to retail. Then is the blacklisting. Over 300 Huawei suppliers faced a secondary sanction, deterring non-US firms from engaging with Huawei. So these sanctions were targeted specifically to to address the broader US-China tech rivalry. What they wanted was Huawei was symbolizing China as a 5G technological asset, and that they wanted to be crippled. This was the game plan. That is what Huawei and China had been saying. And Huawei was the world's second largest smartphone manufacturer. 18% of global share they had, and they had 5G patents. 20% of the global 5G patents was with Huawei. By this, is these credentials made them the prime target for containment. So we have seen semiconductor clusters were removed, software ecosystem was removed, 5G infrastructure was crippled. What were the what were the semiconductor shortage? Pre-sanctions, Huawei High Silicon subsidiary designed high-performance Kirin chips. High Silicon is a subsidiary of Huawei. They have a Kirin chips, Kirin 990. They were manufactured by the Taiwan Semiconductor Company. They had a cutting-edge 5 processors. These powered Huawei's flagship Mate and P series smartphones and 5G base stations. Now, after the impact, Taiwan could not supply, so Huawei was unable to produce the Kirin chips, so the inventory was depleted. So the smartphone sale has to compulsorily decline. It plummeted from 240 million units to 35 million units, almost 85% was lost. Then the 5G equipment strain also happened because there were no advanced chips, so there is no ability to deliver the next gen 5G gear. The cost also went up because alternatives has to be identified. New chips will have to be designed, new manufacturers will have to be identified, new factories will have to be set up. Not only that, China's SMIC offered 14 nanometer chips while they were already working on 5 and 7. So they were two generations behind in the quality or efficiency or productivity, and because of that, 30% almost was the loss of yield or loss of efficiency. The software ecosystem also collapsed because the Google system was not available, Android was not available. So Huawei's phones will have to find an alternative app. In Europe, 80% of the smartphones depend on Play Store compared to China, where domestic alternatives like WeChat are all available. So if you don't have Play Store on a Huawei phone, then the people in Europe may not be willing to go with a Huawei phone. Then the market erosion happened because of this. The smartphone share crashed from 20% to 3%. Accordingly, it will translate into revenue loss. 50% of Huawei's 135 billion revenue shrank to 30 billion annually. The consumer division, the revenue was 135 billion before the sanctions and 30 billion down. User experience gap also happened. Without Google Map or Gmail or YouTube, Huawei phones faced poor reviews because people were not liking it that much as they used to be. So the ban highlighted the risk of software dependency in global trade. So the monopoly of Google on Android created this issue for the Huawei phones. So even India and other countries in Europe started to discuss whether we should continue to use Google's Android. Then comes the 5G setback. Prior to sanctions, Huawei was having 35% share of the global 5G equipment. Almost 50% of the 90 countries in Europe were using 5G from Huawei. Post sanction, the bans were there from UK, Sweden, Australia, etc. And this was forcing them to dismantle the infrastructure. This cost around 2 billion. The loss of market share because Huawei was not allowed to participate in the tenders. Nokia and Ericsson took up those markets. Then came the ripple effect, component shortage. This hampered Huawei's ability to scale the 5G deployment even in friendly markets like Africa. Then finally, the geopolitical backlash. China retaliated by prioritizing domestic vendor in its 200 billion 5G rollout. So Western firms like Cisco could not compete. That was the geopolitical backlash. Secondary supply chain disruption, when we look at non-chip suppliers like Japan's Murata, who had capacitor, or South Korea's LG Chem, who had batteries, they were also not able to deal with Huawei for their shipments to avoid US scrutiny. Then came the shipping firms like FedEx. They were flagged Huawei cargo for extra inspection, raising the freight cost. Then the R&D cost came into picture because you had to design a new software like Synopsys or something, and access to other the Huawei's access to design software was restricted. Huawei had to design new software for their phones to run. So this cost additional 20% R&D expense for Huawei. So the economic toll was very heavy. From 136 billion, it came down to 91 billion, a 33% drop in profits to almost 6 billion only. So the consumer business bore the brunt. While China enterprise and telecom segments showed resilience in China, the consumer business bore the brunt because of these sanctions. This is how a sanction on one entity could cause multiple effects, multiple losses, and multiple implications. Looking at survival tactics, Huawei's response was twofold: ambitious long term strategy and short term survival tactics. This is a blend of pragmatism and innovation. Now, stockpiling of critical components was taken up. Anticipating sanctions, Huawei amassed a 2-year inventory of chips, memory, and components from TSMC, Samsung, and SK, spending 23 billion additionally to hold the inventory. Extended lifetime enabled Huawei to sustain smartphone production through 2021, shipping 189 million units in 2020 despite sanctions. This is an extended lifeline that is sustained the smartphone production. Market retention delayed market share losses in China and Asia Pacific, where 40% was the market share. The limitation was that stockpiles were finite, and by 2022, Huawei had to scale back premium models like P50. Broader context is that the stockpiling exposed the vulnerability in the just-in-time type So the order time, the lead time, the holding cost, all that came into the picture. And peers like Apple increased the buffer stocks, learning from this disruption. Diversifying suppliers away from home is another thing that Huawei did. They shifted from non-US suppliers like Taiwan MediaTek or China's Unisoc or China's BOE instead of LG or Samsung. This helped in partial recovery because mid-range phones could be manufactured using MediaTek chips. Quality trade-off was done. Non-TSMC chips means lesser quality. That means lesser performance. So lesser competitiveness. But still they were able to do some sale in spite of trade-offs. The reliance on Chinese suppliers deepened the exposure to domestic policy shifts. So export control of rare earth means Huawei could not export some components. So non-US suppliers lacked the scale or efficiency that was with Taiwan's semiconductor company. So the cost went up by 25% or the time required went up by 4 to 6 months. Prioritization and cost cutting was there. That means Huawei slashed R&D costs on non-core project. Wearables was taken the second step. Then 5 billion annually was given to software development, chip, and stabilizing the cash flow during revenue declines. Another trade-off is that reduce the consumer brand visibility outside China to accelerate the market share losses in Europe and Latin America. The reduced brand visibility accelerated the market share losses because there was not enough money for marketing. What were the long-term alternative? Harmony OS and Kirin chips were brought into picture. In August 19, a multi-device operating system was replacing Android. This Harmony OS reached 600 million devices in 2024, including smartphones, tablets, and Internet of Things gadgets. This is open source, microkernel based, compatible with Android, and available in Huawei's App Gallery. By 2023, App Gallery had 2 million applications. So it was rivaling Google's ecosystem in China. The impact is that within China, it had a dominance. It captured 25% of the China's mobile market. It also had a global reach, almost in 50 countries, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia. Huawei offered developer subsidies to boost the app ecosystem. The limitation was that it did not have a global developer trust. Only 10% of the top Western apps were natively available. The cost is that Huawei invested 7 billion in Harmony OS, diverting funds from hardware innovation. What is the hardware innovation? Kirin chipset. Huawei's HiSilicon accelerated R&D, partnering with China's SMIC to produce 7 nanometer Kirin chips by 2023, which was earlier available only in Taiwan. The milestone is that Mate 60 Pro featured SMIC Mate 7 chip enabling 5G connectivity and marking a breakthrough in sanctions evasion. That means what? Innovation was in hand, though at a cost. Market recovery started. That is, Huawei's China smartphone share rebounded to 50% in Q3 2023, surpassing Apple's 20%. Why? Because the SMIC locally made 7 nano chips were available, which helped 5G connectivity. Then comes the global constraint. The SMIC had a capacity of only 10% of Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing company. So, the more smartphones cannot be manufactured. So what Huawei had to do? They had to spend another 15 billion on semiconductors, crowding out other innovations. But what they were successful in? They were successful in building an US independent supply chain. They scaled up the chip design. They covered 80% of Huawei's needs. And they partnered with SMIC, CXMT or YMTC and other Chinese companies to localize the production. And 70% of the components were locally sourced in compared to 2019. So the impact is that reliance on US components or software came down. 90% was non-US. So there is no impact of sanction, we can say, in the Huawei Mate 70 series. But the risk is that, or the pain is that the cost surged, 40% additional cost, and a 10 to 15% decline in efficiency. But you have the innovation lag. China's 7mm tech trials versus TSMC's 3mm, capping Huawei's ability to compete in premium markets. Huawei's pivot entrenched the role in China tech self-sufficiency drive, aligning Beijing 350 billion semiconductor push during the last 5 years. Last one is the market realignment. Huawei was able to expand into sanctions-resistant market. For example, Russia, Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, where US influence was weaker or Google is less critical. China invested 10 billion in 5G cloud. Middle East signed a 5 billion in 5G deals with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar with China and Huawei. This leveraged the Belt and Road Partnership. In Africa, 4G, 5G was deployed in 40 plus countries. Russia, Huawei expanded the market after the Western firms had to leave in the Ukraine crisis. Nokia had existed 2022. So 30% of the Russia's 5G market was with Huawei. Now, that is in 24-25. So revenue stabilization was helped by these developments. Almost 80% of Huawei's 100 billion revenue in 23 was helped by these developments. Huawei sold 70 million phones in 2023, up 60% from the earlier 20%. The risk is that over reliance on politically volatile market like Russia and Iran. Legal and political impacts. Lobbying is one. Huawei filed a lawsuit against the US government. They argued entity list violated the due process. They lobbied with the EU government to resist the 5G ban. US courts upheld the sanctions, but lawsuits delayed the enforcement, giving Huawei 6 to 12 months to pivot. Germany and France allowed partial Huawei 5G use, but UK and Sweden enforced a full ban. So lobbying did not work well. The legal battle consumed 500 million, straining Huawei's finances. Then strengthening ties in China. Huawei deepened ties with Beijing, aligning with China's Made in China or chip independence goal. 30 billion in subsidies was received and concession loans were received. Preferential contracts were given in the China's 1 trillion digital infrastructure plan. More importantly, it had access to the talent pool, state-backed engineers, with Huawei's hiring of 10,000 chip specialists in the last 5 years. The impact is domestic resilience and global perception change because reinforced the US claims of Huawei's state ties was proved by Huawei getting closer to the Chinese government. So this justified further bans. That is the impact of this development. Then public relations and soft power was adopted by Huawei. What does it mean? It launched a global campaign to counter espionage narratives, investing 200 million in PR activities. They sponsored events in Asia, Africa, and all. They improved the brand trust in emerging markets, 60% approval in Nigeria, but a minimal impact on Western markets where 70% of the consumers viewed Huawei skeptically. So, what are the lessons that we learned? The share price of Huawei went down, the market share also went down. So, that is the financial impact. In the new ecosystem, the Harmony Voice was there, Kirin chipsets were brought in, Huawei Cloud is there, and automotive tech is there. But the main thing is that diversification to mitigate the dependency risk, stockpiling as a stopgap but not a solution, investing in in-house capabilities, uh, bringing out Harmony OS, geopolitical agility is the need of the hour, and state business alignment has trade-offs because when you are closer to Chinese government, you will be farther away from the other governments because of the suspicion or skepticism. So the global challenge is that 5G bans persist. Smartphone sales outside China is not growing adequately. The decoupling of the Huawei's Mate 70 series and SMIC's 5M trials are having some progress but with some gaps. The future is diversification into cloud computing and automotive tech. So this highlights how fragile is a global supply chain in a geopolitical landscape that is fractured with different views and opinions and intercountry politics. This accelerated the US-China tech decoupling, with China adequately racing in the 5G world in spite of ban on semiconductors and other things because they invested around 500 billion in 5 years for countering the US Chips Act. Thanks for watching this video. We have come to an end of the risks in international